Okay, yeah. So good morning to everybody. Thank you very much for coming to our panel. This is panel 11, Beyond the State, Emerging Actors in Land Governance in Sub-Saharan Africa. And maybe just a very quick introduction from myself and Yue Zhu, the conveners for this panel. My name is Carolyn Dieterle. I'm a fourth-year PhD student at the Department for International Development at the LSE. Studying large-scale land investments and land governance in Uganda and Sierra Leone. And yeah, my colleague Yue Zhu.
Thank you everyone for coming. And I'm also a PhD candidate at London School of Economics. My name is Yue Zhu Yang in the Department of International Development. And my work is studying Chinese agricultural investment project in Tanzania, Zambia, and trying to see how the land governance has now overlooked but critical determinant of Chinese our foreign direct investment in African agriculture. And this is our so we take the initiative to organize this panel, so bring people together which interested in the same topic about the state and various actors in the land-related issues in sub-Saharan Africa.
Yeah. Great. So yeah, our panel is, we kept it quite broad and interdisciplinary on purpose to include all kinds of different papers. Yeah, like Yue Zhu said, our main interest broadly are actors and agency in the context of land governance in sub-Saharan Africa. And this can include many more actors than the central state, including new actors coming on the scene, the international community, private sector investments, NGOs, peasant movements, grassroots movements, and domestic elites. And yeah, we're interested in how these interact, to what extent, to what developmental effects. Yeah, so it looks like we have 3 papers. We used to have 4, but due to the Corona situation, you know, not everybody was able to make it and all that. But yeah, I'm just going to walk you through very quickly through the sequence of our papers here. So the first paper, Yue Zhu is going to present her paper on property institutions, politics, and foreign investment in Africa. After that, we have a presenter, Osino Olatokunbo, and his co-authors presenting a paper on emerging actors and the bureaucracy of government in agricultural land allocations in Nigeria. And then I am also going to represent a paper on international codes of conduct in the context of large-scale land investments and contested property rights in Uganda. And we were thinking the format for the panel to, if there are immediate questions after each presentation, that we can ask them right away, but maybe to keep the broader questions till the end where we could have a Q&A for all 3 presenters. Okay, so if there are no immediate burning issues or questions, I think we might get started here in the interest of time.
Okay, hello everyone again. Thanks for coming in this early morning, virtually sitting there. This is, as I said, I'm a PhD candidate at LSE, and this I will give a presentation as a snapshot on PhD dissertation project, and my main I take a look at Chinese agricultural investment projects in Tanzania, Zambia, and my main argument is that the land governance is a critical determinant of Chinese outward foreign direct investment. I will say it as OFDI for short in the following presentation in African agriculture. So with China's increasing economic presence in Africa, great scholarly and the policy-making attention is drawn to investigate Chinese OFDI in African agriculture. However, this investigation is hampered and under-theorized due to poor understanding of two main factors. I think first is the poor understanding of African land governance, and the second is poor understanding of Chinese. Sorry, I haven't go to that slide yet. Can we go back to the first slide? Yes, right. The second feature is about the poor understanding of the Chinese economic actors overseas, and I think right because of the lack of knowledge of these two factors that fuels anxiety on Chinese scramble and Chinese land grab, and that is why we see this overwhelming portion of Chinese investors acting under central command become neo-imperialists to exploit and dominate African countries who are not able to self-govern. And this kind of discourse is it's kind of like everywhere we can hear from the Western media and even some scholarship. And in the rest of the presentation, I hope I can make a convincing case for you to show you how wrong this discourse is. So let's start with a broader question that what determines patterns of China's for FDI in African country. So if we brainstorming here and think about usually what we hear from the like a radio or TV or something, we would, is it everything like this for things quite familiar? Like is it all about like oil, natural resource, geopolitics, or promoting China's standards, dumping Chinese goods, deploying excess capacities? And all these things, they have one thing in common, that they are all focused on the China side to explain the China-Africa encounter. But the problem of this high group of literature is that there's a fundamental assumption that the Chinese government plays a significant role in defining its FDI in Africa. And this assumption is based on two preconceptions. At first, most FDI from China to Africa is state-owned enterprise, which we know is not accurate. The Good 2009, like 11 years ago, already observed the trend of Chinese FDI in Africa is emerging small to medium-sized enterprise and settlers, which are out of Chinese government radar. And the second, preconception is that because the ownership structure of SOE, Chinese government has full control on its investments in Africa. And we all know then in following a group of study, we figured that this is also not true. So in the book 2016 by William Norris, he studied the detailed cases to show that even within the SOE, Beijing doesn't have full control of companies abroad. So my work will contribute to this critique by showing that first, there is country-to-country differences. Like in the right side of the slide, this chart is generated by my fieldwork data, which shows that Tanzania and Zambia, these two countries, in terms of Chinese African agricultural project in these two countries, they have very different total amount in terms of size and also the firm structure and a configuration of the firm ownership. And then second, we see most of FDI in agriculture in Zambia are conducted by private actors. So, and the majority of these FDI are not formally registered with Chinese officials in Zambia. And third, there is much looser tie between SOEs and the Chinese government than people imagined and portrayed in the general discourse. So another tendency is that characterize most existing literature on China-Africa is taking African state as largely undifferentiated, taking them as all the same, as all weak, passive, or even failed for granted. And this is also the tendency, the literature in African studies in general, as termed pathologizing African states by Tandika in 2015. So such easy acceptance of weak African state claims suggest that the examination of the phenomenon question would be hindered by preconceptions and prejudices held by researchers. So I hope I have enough time to get into the detail, but I just want to highlight one specific example that show why this will, it's an important step to take African agency into the analysis. Like when different scholars study the exact same Chinese FDI in Zambian copper mining, when the Hawklong 2008 have the premises that African state are weak state, low capacity to regulate. His study concludes that particular characteristics of Chinese FDI risk undermining the local regulatory institution. But in contrary, Chin-Kwang Lee, her book and her continuous study finds that the Zambian government has clear developmental strategies and better organized labor regime in mining sector comparing to construction sector, and thus Zambian government indeed able to leverage the particularity of Chinese FDI to achieve its developmental goal in mining sector. So I believe one way to step aside from analytically unhelpful claims such as weak state is to insert African agency in political economic analysis of Chinese OFDI in Africa, and the role of African agents in shaping the rule of engagements with China and its developmental potential remains largely unexplored and provides a way out of current predicament. But luckily, we do see a growing body of literature has taken this step. And as in the slides, we show there some study about the state, the political agency, the bureaucratic agency, and the social agency, and forward. And in my work, I believe in the same line with the African agency perspective, a common theme is emerging from the literature on Chinese agricultural investments in Africa, which is the ability of local actors to exercise their agency that is in proximity to their access and rights to claim land. So for instance, in the case of Ghana, we see the Chinese rural entrepreneurs rely on resourceful either Chinese businessmen or Ghanaian intermediaries to acquire land. And in the case of Mozambique, even though the expansion of Wanbao is supported by the high-level, state-level political officials to gain access to land, but then they will still encounter the local level land disputes by the local land users. So in summary, the empirical data suggests that the Chinese agricultural investments in Africa is contingent upon the access and rights of land that is available, and various actors at different levels of African society has exercised the agency in the negotiation process with Chinese agricultural investors. And these African actors ranging from local users, local elites, government officials, to state elites. And in these cases, the local actors' agency comes from their access and their rights to claim land. So in addition to individual agency per se, as I just described, or this local actors or the government officials, we also, in my work, I focus on the institutional and the structural factors that enable these individual actors who exercise their agency on land-related matters. And these broader structural factors include the national land laws, regulations, policies that differ across African countries and sectors, and that play an important role in shaping patterns of Chinese FDI in African agriculture. So next slide is about my argument. So the general argument, as I keep repeating, is I argue the African nations' formal institutions explore regulation policies in the agricultural sector are important in defining FDI, foreign FDI, and in my case, important in defining Chinese FDI. And the breakdown, I have like 4 sub-arguments. And then the right side of the chart is, and I apologize this, I haven't updated this theoretical framework yet, but bear with me, let me explain it a little bit. So, so my thesis takes cue from the conceptualization of variety of capital by Qinquan Li in her book in 2016, and land tenure regimes by Catherine Boone in her book in 2014. And this thesis developed a categorical theorization of land investment patterns. So to explain variation in foreign land investment in Africa. So 6 factors are I capture 6 factors, 3 from each side. So I'm trying to put the Chinese economic actors vis-a-vis host country political property institutions, both as my independent variables, and they both have 3 main features. So for the Chinese economic actors, I believe they have I captured 3 main features. The first is financing instruments. The second is logic of accumulation, and the third is risk tolerance. And to break it down, so I observe and categorize 3 types of economic actors. They are the state-owned enterprises and the private multinational enterprises and the settlers. So the 3 actors, economic actors, they have the different, they varies in terms of 3 main features. So for instance, the state-owned enterprises, they have state financing, and their logic accumulation is profit optimization. They bear the dual interest of profit, but also the political interest to some extent. And the third, the risk tolerance is very high, especially due to the first combining factor of the state financing and the dual interest. But in very contrast to the settlers, their financial instruments is from the saving or loan from the family or friends, and their accumulation logic is profit maximization. They want to gain enough capital, and then their risk tolerance is very low. Then on the left side is about the land governance rules. I also make 3 features under this factor. They have the land market availability, they have registration on foreign ownership, and the judicial methods. And these 3 features are mainly due to the land governance realities in African countries. So in the case of Tanzania, Zambia, we see they both, so one of the legacy of British colonial rule is a dual land governance system. So we have the leasehold state land with private property right title that is allocated through market mechanism, and vis-a-vis the customary land or village land with collective ownership that is under authority-based allocation. So the post-independence land laws recognize existing land holding systems and regulate land access based on citizenship. And this means foreigner has no direct access to customary or village land, which is restricted to citizens and in some cases members of certain identity-based groups. And foreign national can only legally access to land that is under state control, which is a leasehold state land. So so that based on this description, kind of give you the idea why I have the land market availability and restriction on foreign ownership, two features under land governance rules. And the third one, jurisdiction method, territorial jurisdiction, is because along the same line of logic of a foreigner and citizen divide, we see that non-citizen has to convert customary land into leasehold state land first to gain access, to be granted access from the state. And through this land conversion, the land has been transferred from the chief or village territory to the central state. So there is there is a conversion in terms of both the judicial methods from the local court to the central state-run court, also the territorial jurisdiction, either from the village jurisdiction to the state. So that is 6 main factors. I will 6 main investigative factors I will explore in the thesis. And the next slide is about sorry, where's the next slide? Right, research design. So I take a median and comparative case study approach. My case are Chinese agricultural investment projects in Tanzania, Zambia. So each with its attribute of timing, location, and forms. And I don't claim these cases are exhaustive because I probably couldn't find some very new cases like happen right now, but they're almost exhaustive. So the comparison and the case selection strategies are in line with Mill's methods of difference. So as a national level comparison, I believe Tanzania and Zambia are the most similar cases. They share the similar size of arable land, agroclimate, and also the similar foreign relation to China continually, and the amount of Chinese contractors, number of workers present in these two countries are also similar. So what different between these two is a key investigation variable, which is property institutions inland. So we see in the cross-country comparison, we see in Tanzania that the landlords classify foreigner as second class. It suggests that the accessibility to Tanzania state land in their legal term general land differs from Tanzanian citizen and foreign national. And in contrast, the land law in Zambia didn't discriminate the state land access based on citizenship. It sees foreign national as equal to Zambian citizens. So in summary, I believe that Tanzania has stricter rules and land law policy than Zambia. And also my research embraced the second layer of comparison, which is a subnational level. Also the subnational region shares overall similarities, so we can safely claim that the main differences will be the land holding system within a country. And this divergence across country and variation within country provide me an analytical device to explore the subject in questions. That is why we see the Chinese agricultural projects differ in terms of timing, location, and forms. So if my argument holds true, that the land governance is a critical determinant. Can I move to the second slide, please? Next slide, thank you. If my argument holds true that land governance is a critical determinant of Chinese OFDI in African agriculture, then we should expect to see, first in timing, we should expect to see after land reforms, more liberal land regulatory regimes in Zambia should attract more FDI. And in recent 2017, the land policy review in Zambia should slow down the FDI trend. And the second, in terms of location, we should see FDI mostly on the state land. And this speaks to the land market availability factor I claimed before. And then the third, we should see the forms that the private capital would risk to convert Kashmir land to leasehold state land. And this is a unique risk-taking behavior of Chinese private. There is consider of land market availability for foreigner, but at the same time, the state would consider counter land commercialization to remain control. And due to the time limit, I might not be able to get to the location and the forms. The second or third part, I will only focus on to explain the timing. So in next slides, this is also based on the fieldwork data. The chart summarizes the number of new Chinese land-based agriculture investment in each period. So in each period, the number is a new agricultural project. So so we see the first China has long relation with Tanzania, Zambia, dating back to the 1960s. And from 1960s to the 1990s, this period, we see the similar patterns of Chinese agricultural engagements in Tanzania, pairing with Tanzania. And this is also, we can see it aid period, because as a moment, all these projects are aid projects, are not really owned either by state or the private sector. So so in this period, Chinese aid assisted 4 Tanzania state farms, while there's no land-based agriculture aid project in Zambia. Then we moving on to the early 1990s, when is the start of land economic and political liberalization, and also the land liberalization. We see Zambia has hosted ever since like 6 Chinese state-owned enterprises in farming agriculture. And in comparison to Zambia, in Tanzania, after Land Act of 1999, Tanzania had 1 Chinese SOE in farming agriculture, and Chinese private agriculture investment projects, especially the size of small to medium private Chinese farmer and rural entrepreneurs, surged between 2010 and 2014, and then started to slow down the pace after the policy uncertainties of land in Zambia. And that is the time they started to review the national land policy in Zambia. So there are also along the time, there are fluctuates from time to time with a change of domestic policy and political campaigns. So for instance, the 2010, the Tanzania national discourse on land grab emerged, expressing underlying concerns on corruption and the legitimacy of foreign involvement in the economy. And this appeared to further constrain foreign investments in land. And in 2007, as I mentioned, Zambia started their national land policy review, and this has increased the political uncertainty and appeared to have slowed down the interest in land investment. And this finding on timing of investment projects, combined with investor description on investment decision-making process, suggests that host countries' land governance practices, especially the restriction on foreign ownership on land, play a significant role in defining Chinese agriculture. Yeah, I think that this is about timing part, and and thank you very much. This is all my presentation. I hope we have more chance to talk more about the form and the location, but because I think my time is up. Okay, can we move to the next slides, which is basically the end? Yeah, thank you so much. So our next, if we have any question at the moment, if not, so our next presenter, so shall we move to the next presenter, who will be...
Hi, sorry, this is kind of... Yueju, are you still there?
Yes, I'm here. I'm trying to find our next presenter.
Right. Okay, well, first, maybe should we just quickly see if there are any questions, any burning questions right now? Otherwise,
sure.
Right. In the Q&A at the end of the panel. Okay, I don't see any raised hands right now, so I assume we can move on for the moment.
Right.
Yueju, thank you very much, and we'll get back to questions for you later. Yes, so should we move on to our next presenters? Yes, so if, I don't know, we have a wonderful volunteer helping us here with the technical stuff, Ugochukwu Okoye, thank you very much. Could you help us broadcast Mr. Osinobu Olatukunbo, who will present his paper together with his co-authors from the Ogun State Ministry of Agriculture in Nigeria. I hope we have him here in the list of participants so we can broadcast him here. Just a moment. Okay, it says poor connection, so I suggest that we'll move on, which is my paper, and then we'll get back to Osinobu to see if his connection is better then. Right, okay. So yes, so we're just swapping out right now to see if the connection of our third presenter will be better later, but I hope you can hear me fine. Yes, okay. So I'm presenting a part of my field work for my PhD. I researched large-scale land investments in Uganda and Sierra Leone in 2018 and 2019. And this paper that I'm presenting now covers a part of the findings, a part of the data from Uganda. And yes, maybe I will get started. So I think I can move the slides on my own. Perfect. Okay. So yes, just to give a quick introduction. So I'm interested in the phenomenon of large-scale land investments, which I understand as, I'm looking at them as more generally as a form of a land enclosure by which a private individual or a company, usually a foreign company, but there are also domestic companies, are acquiring large chunks of land in a developing country. And sort of the phenomenon I'm particularly interested in is the transfer of use away from the use from local people for farming or whatever they were doing on the ground to the monocropping use of a company. And I'm sure you're familiar. I mean, this happens in all kinds of sectors. There's palm oil, sugarcane, coffee, cocoa, forestry investments, all kinds of things, and they vary in sizes and other factors. But I'm generally looking at the phenomenon of land use change in that. And yes, perhaps you were familiar with the debate about this. This has been a big topic on the sort of global agenda in the last decade, in the name of land grabbing and all that, where we have a lot of activists and civil society organizations advocating against it, highlighting the human rights violations, smallholder dispossession, environmental pollution, and some other negative effects. And on the other side of the spectrum, on the other side of the debate, there are more let's call them mainstream development actors that argue that investments are very beneficial if they're done right. So there are lots of benefits coming from foreign direct investments, such as job opportunities, expansion of infrastructure, technology transfers, food security benefits, and all that. So that is basically the debate I'm tapping into. And the narrative has evolved very much towards that, yes, if investments are done right, so if conflict can be avoided, then it is a win-win scenario, basically. And so that has led to a massive creation and proliferation of voluntary guidelines and sort of codes of conduct and standards created at the international level by international actors to sort of discipline land deals and incentivize host country governments in developing countries and investors themselves to create more sustainable investments so that win-win scenarios can properly unfold. So I'm just going to show you this slide, just to show you the scale of this trend of international guidelines and standards that are coming up. And that sort of run parallel to the whole debate around large-scale land investments and land grabbing. So you can see here there's all these main development organizations and main actors on the world stage. We have the World Bank, the European Union, the African Union, the UN organizations, especially the Food and Agriculture Organization, several country national development agencies, and also big NGOs and civil society organizations, Oxfam and all that. They have come up with their own set of standards, or in collaboration with others. And just in the middle circle, you can see a few of those, which I'm not going to go into every detail. And yes, these standards sort of vary a bit in the priorities they set or in the target audience, but there are far more commonalities between them than there are differences. And so they all sort of argue or call for more transparency in land deals, the inclusion and participation of local land users, environmental safeguards against pollution and all these factors. And what I found very interesting is that almost all of these guidelines and sets of sort of codes of conduct call for the protection of legitimate land tenure rights at the local level. And I found that very interesting. I found that with this whole narrative and trend on the international arena about codes of conduct, there were several things that are not really explored yet. Technically, if all these guidelines exist and are implemented and work the way they are promoted, then we should see the mitigation of conflict in large-scale land deals, which is not what we see. There's still lots of conflict and lots of the same issues happening. And concretely for my fieldwork, so in Uganda, I saw that not only are conflicts around large-scale land investments so very prevalent, I also found that the use of international guidelines is very uneven across different land deals in the country. So some investment cases were making a lot of reference to international guidelines, were using them, others were not at all, and some they were present but weren't used really in for the issue of local land rights. So it was sort of a puzzle to me. How do these guidelines actually work in practice, and how do they achieve what they set out to do, and how can they truly protect legitimate land tenure rights at the local level? So a long-winded start here, but this is basically, in this paper, I'm looking at the use of international guidelines for 3 cases of large-scale land investments in Uganda. And so I basically, to repeat my research questions here, why do international guidelines seemingly have uneven use and varying degrees of success in mitigating conflict around large-scale land investments? And why do international guidelines seem to be effective in dealing with some types of land transactions and making them more legitimate to claimants, but seem to be ineffective or worse with dealing with other claims? And I would like to front load my main argument here straight away to make this a bit clearer. So I'm basically arguing that I see from my research in Uganda that international guidelines really only gain traction in land deals where local land rights are already state recognized, and in practice and in law. And I argue in a second argument that this state recognition of land rights depends on the underlying land tenure arrangement or land tenure regime that varies over space in Uganda. And so, so basically, I argue that in order to understand how these guidelines work, we need to understand what land governance arrangements they encounter on the ground during a large-scale foreign land investment. And I will get to more, I will explain the different land tenure arrangements in a minute here. Just to say a word on the method. So this slide shows more what I did generally in Uganda for my PhD fieldwork, which I conducted mostly in 2018 for 6 months and 2020 for a follow-up month in January before the Corona crisis hit. So I was lucky to have one more month. Yeah, so I basically, in Uganda, I conducted a structured focus comparison of, I had around 12 cases of large-scale land investments across the country, across different land tenure regimes and land governance structures. And my data is based on around 150 interviews and focus group discussions with multi-stakeholders around land investment deals. So that includes the investors themselves, farm managers, government representatives at the local level, at the central level, community groups, traditional authorities, leaders, chiefs, NGOs, international donor organizations. So everybody who has a stake or has some claim around authority or knowledge around large-scale land investments. And then to be more precise, for this paper, I looked at 3 cases. They're circled here. You can see, one in the bottom, in the central region, in the eastern region, and in the northern region, which coincides with different land tenure regimes. Again, I will get to the tenure regimes and what that means in a minute here. Just to show you, I compared 3 cases across 3 different tenure regimes. Here they are. So basically in Uganda, there are 4 recognized tenure regimes in the constitution, and I'm grouping them a little differently here now. So there are, just to show the variety, there is private owned land, so titled private property, which falls under freehold tenure and Milo tenure. Milo is a form of freehold private property. I will get to that more in the next slide. Which is only in the central region. Customary land tenure is covers about 80% of all land tenure arrangements in the country. And state-owned public land is what I refer to, mostly nature reserves, forests, swamp lands, all the public land governed by the central state. So now I will go a bit more into detail, and with each land tenure regime, I will explain the corresponding case study so that it becomes more clear. Oh yeah, sorry, this is another slide to show you a bit the geographical allocation of land tenure regimes in Uganda. So a note here, this is not clear cut, that's not a perfect overlapping of a certain tenure regime with a certain region, but there are very strong tendencies. For example, the central region, the green in the middle here, the Buganda Kingdom is all mostly Milo land, or let's say Milo land doesn't exist outside of this green central region. And then you have the northern and eastern regions, that is the purple and the yellow, which mostly has unregistered customary land. And then the pink on the pink western region here, which is the most mixed sort of region, where you have some customary land, but also a lot of freehold private property and leasehold. And yeah, so as I said, it's not a perfect overlap. And across the whole country, you have pockets of state-owned land. So forests and swamplands and rivers will be everywhere. But just to give you an idea how this varies in Uganda. Okay, now moving on. So I wanted to say a few more words about Milo land. Milo is a very sort of unique land tenure category to Uganda. It's the oldest land tenure regime originating in the beginning of the colonial era. And it is, as I said before, it's a form of freehold where you have a landlord who owns the property, who owns the land plot, and you have tenants on the land. that are the land users, but they also have state-recognized rights to this land. And in a land transaction, you have to get the approval of both the landlord and the tenants. And this is a land tenure regime that has been in legal frameworks since about 100 years. So I argue that Milo tenure consists of state-recognized lands for both the landlord and the tenants. And my argument building on top of that is that international guidelines are able to gain traction. They are able to sort of enforce and protect Milo land rights, or engage with land conflicts that involve Milo land rights, because it is a legible tenure regime. So this is not to say that there are no conflicts on Milo land. There are lots of conflicts, but that you can claim them in a court of law, and it is a more legible and official procedure then. So basically, in a nutshell, I argue here that Milo land rights are de jure and de facto recognized. And then moving right on to my case study on Milo land. To not make this super long, I'm just going to be a bit more precise, more quick with this. So I looked at the vegetable oil palm development project, which is a palm oil plantation on the shores off the shores of Lake Victoria on Bugala Island. And the interesting thing here is this forms part of the central region, so there's a lot of Milo land. And in this case, the government acquired bought land from the Milo landlords, and then transferred it as a lease to foreign investors for the palm oil plantation. And it was done in a very legible, very official land acquisition format of willing buyer, willing seller. And there were some problems. It wasn't very easy to figure out which landlords and which tenants claim ownership over which kind of Milo plot. So it's a very tedious, long process. But the interesting thing is not that there was conflict. I think that's fairly normal in these land acquisition processes and contestation and all that. But the way they were handled is very different to some other land acquisition cases, where in this case there were court cases, and there were international grievance mechanisms that could be invoked and to solve the land related conflict. And in the end, for the expansion of the project, the government and the company paid compensation to all different layers of land of Milo tenants, and were very careful not to infringe on land rights. So the Milo land rights were very much center stage of this process. And the role of the international guidelines was very present with that, and especially through these international grievance mechanisms that basically were local land conflict cases were catapulted to the international arena. Contrasting that very strongly is another case on state land. So as I said before, there are pockets of state land, mostly nature reserves, especially central forest reserves. And so talking a little bit about this land tenure, this is held by the government, and people who live in the forests or who claim forest access rights are not state recognized, neither by law nor in practice. And so I argue that international guidelines are unable to address these rights because the government already doesn't recognize user rights. And to just illustrate this more clearly, I'm going to skip right to the case study on that. So I looked at a forest investment in the eastern region, the Bukaleva Central Forest Reserve, which is also off the shores of Lake Victoria, but in the eastern region. And in this case, there were several villages living inside of the forest. Several communities living in villages inside of the forest. And they claimed historical metaphorical rights to this forested land, arguing that previous administrations, especially under the Idi Amin regime, had actually actively invited communities inside the forest. There was a government-run development project. People were allocated land in forests also as part of patronage resources and as gifts and rewards for military service. So a range of different reasons, but people were given land inside the forest by the state. And so with the regime change, basically, to the current Museveni regime, it seems that these forest access and user rights were sort of extinguished. And now people living inside the forest, even for generations, were considered to be squatters. And what happened when this foreign company came in, the government forcefully evicted most of these communities. And there was contestation and protest about that. But interestingly, international guidelines and standards that were invoked with the coming in of the foreign company, they did not address at all the land-related issues, the land-related conflict. International standards were invoked for environmental issues, for climate change, carbon issues, and all that. So they were present, these guidelines, but they were not able to gain traction, or there was no engagement with the sort of the claims and of local forest dwellers. And up to this day, there are still people in the forest with unclear tenure status and in land rights, and but very little traction when it comes to the international engagement with that. Just to then again contrast with the third tenure regime that I want to show today is customary land, which covers the majority of the land in Uganda. And this is sort of a mix of both the other tenure regimes where you have legal recognition. Customary land is very much set in stone in the legal framework of Uganda. The constitution calls for equal treatment of customary land as to be on par with private property such as freehold, milo, leasehold land. And so it is there enshrined in the legal frameworks, but I see that in practice, unregistered customary land is often not protected and not so easy to, let's say, defend in a court of law, which has to do also with the fact that it is not titled or registered. But anyway, so here you have the sort of de jure, but not the de facto recognition, state recognition of land rights. Therefore, I argue that the international guidelines in this case also fall into this sort of void where they cannot overstep the state. If the government decides to not recognize customary claims in a certain case of land investment, then international guidelines are also sort of handbound or cannot really act to protect local land rights if the state decides they're not valid in this case, even though the legal framework calls generally for the recognition of customary rights. Just to illustrate this with my third case study, this is in northern Uganda in the Acholi subregion, where in this case, a foreign investor directly approached a family of an extended family on customary land and arranged a deal with them to lease land from them. And in this case, the investor helped to solidify and formalize the customary land claims of this family by converting the land to a freehold title. So this is a possibility in the legal framework, but it's very pricey and it's very tedious, and most customary land users don't have the financial means or the knowledge or the access to do this. This involves official surveyors from the state. It's a very lengthy process. And so in this case, the foreign investor actually paid for this and promoted this. And so at the district land board in Atiak, they converted this plot of customary land to freehold land. And so this is sort of a tricky case when you relate it to the international guidelines and standards. Most of these guidelines, this move would be in the spirit of international guidelines, because it is usually a good thing to engage directly with the landowners or the land users on the ground and not go through the central government, but to negotiate and hatch out a deal about leasing land from local people. But I argue that in this case, sort of the intent of the international guidelines was a bit subverted, because in the end, the customary land tenure was converted to a private title, and that went along with the exclusion of other communal customary landowners and claims involved in that, of neighbors or people around, that argued that their land rights were not recognized or were not taken into account, and that this one family was able to solidify their land claims on the, and they were losing out. And by chance, this family was also very influential, was quite wealthy in the region. And so it is sort of like a power dynamic that has come into play here. And I would argue that it is questionable how international guidelines are able to deal with customary land rights generally, if they just picked out sort of one family to solidify their claims and then convert it into a more legible land tenure regime, which is freehold. So were they really able to deal with customary claims? It seems doubtful. All right, so just to bring this to an end, some findings and conclusions. I argue from what I observe in my 3 case studies that international codes of conduct are limited when there is legal ambiguity around land rights and when land claims are not state recognized. So basically, that means that the types of risks and conflicts that the guidelines set out to guard against do not really correspond to the types of conflicts that we see on the ground, because these conflicts are often sort of more invisible, or they are sort of blurry, uncertain territory where there's no registered land rights, where there's multiple overlap of claims. But I argue that is exactly these sort of gray zones, these where the most intractable land conflicts happen. And a lot of people, there's a common lived reality in a lot of sub-Saharan African countries, that people do not have a very clear, written, enshrined, protected private property. That's actually definitely not the norm. And so international guidelines are mostly able to only work with or engage with or can sort of gain traction when they are dealing with these very legible land types of land rights. That is an important thing to know for the authors of international guidelines, or for this whole sort of trend. Yeah, and basically that's that most of the land conflicts and the land issues on the ground are a bit outside of the reach of international guidelines. And this becomes much even more interesting when you think about the status that some of these international guidelines have currently on the world stage in a way. So one of the very famous guidelines, the voluntary guidelines on the governance of tenure, the VGGT, which have come out by the Committee on World Food Security and the FAO. Just a quote here, it says, "There is now an international consensus and agreed normative standard for what responsible human rights-based and land governance should look like." If this claim is really, excuse me, holds true, it seems very distant to what is actually going on the ground in many of these countries where these guidelines are supposedly implemented to make land deals more sustainable. Because what is what is an agreed normative standard for responsible land governance, and for whom, and who loses out? And so these are the questions I'm interested in and to further research. And as my last slide here, I just want to flash a bit of attention to some further implications, where I argue that generally there should be more research done on how the domestic level actually matters in these large-scale land investments. And that's, I have the feeling there's often an assumption that international guidelines or codes of conduct as a blueprint, they can be applied to a domestic legal structure and be held by that structure in a very straightforward way. But I think there's a lot of contradiction here and a lot of unexpected actors on the scene that will have a lot of influence on how such guidelines can or cannot be applied or invoked. And so the role of domestic elites and authorities that can be unexpected actors like traditional authorities or influential families on the ground, or land brokers, middlemen, all kinds of domestic actors play into this here. And this is often something ignored or not that people are not aware of when sort of promoting international guidelines and standards. And then lastly, that also history matters. And I found throughout my fieldwork that the way that land tenure regimes vary in Uganda and that are accumulated in certain geographical regions goes back to a long history of how formal legal authority structures were developed. And this has to do as well with the colonial imprint on legal structures. And in order to understand this sort of playing field and the context, that it is really important to take historic events into account as well. I think I'm just going to leave it at that. I hope I didn't overtake too much time here. Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much for your presentation, Caroline. Let's see if we have any questions at the moment. At the meantime, we were still trying to connect our third panelist, Dr. Osinova from the Ministry of Agriculture, and we are still experiencing some technical issue. And thanks for our volunteer, Ugochukwu, is helping very much for resolving this. Can we try again to see if we can connect our third panelist? Hello.
Hello.
Hello. We can hear you.
Hi, you got me? Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Me?
Hi, Julian. How are you?
Yeah. Hi. No, I've got several comments and questions. I wonder whether or not we ought to decide whether or not we're going to go into discussion properly of the papers, because other people may have comments too, or whether or not we're going to wait. They're not really little questions, so I'm concerned about kicking off discussion if our third presenter is going to be able to connect, in fact.
Yes, I think since it's been a bit of a technical issue for a while now, why don't we go ahead with the discussion and see once we have clarity on whether our third presenter is able to present, then we can sort of interrupt our discussion. I think that's the only way right now, because I don't think he's ready right now. There seems to be no connection. So I would suggest we go ahead for the moment.
Okay. All right. Well, my comment and questions are really that I think we've had a very interesting empirical contribution from both the papers that were presented about how large-scale land investments take place and the role of the external and internal actors involved. And I think the conclusions that really the outcomes are going to vary considerably according to the local land tenure context is fundamental. My questions are really about what place you as authors see international guidelines as having in the land governance system, and what roles they actually play and what else is needed. And I think it's worth recognizing that the voluntary guidelines on the governance of tenure are not just about land investment. They're about the governance of tenure, and they really are a kind of strong they represent a strong international consensus on principles, but they're not really practical and operational guidelines. They are invoked in the cases of large-scale land investment, but it's not really surprising that if a piece of international soft law is not translated into national hard law, then the outcomes are not going to be as the guidelines seek to prescribe. I mean, I think that is pretty obvious. But the question I would ask is, what else do you think is needed? What practical place do you think the voluntary guidelines on the governance of tenure or other practical guidelines on investment that derive from them should and do have in land tenure systems, land governance on the ground? And what else is needed for them to have traction? And particularly on China, what I wasn't clear about is clearly there's a wide range of private actors involved. It's not only state controlled, but at some points in the presentation, you seem to suggest that the Chinese government does indeed have considerable control and over the kind of investment patterns, over the incentives that are given to the actors the private actors involved. So, and that is something that is talked about quite a lot, that really the voluntary guidelines and other international soft law principles have very little traction in China. There are quite a lot of investors in Africa and elsewhere in the oil palm sector who are very much targeting Chinese markets where the standards, consumer standards, value chain standards over the produce are not nearly as tight as they are in the West, where they tend to reflect the principles of international soft law, and that consequently Chinese capitalism, both in the way that China is encouraging external settlement, often in ignorance of land governance conditions on the ground, and if you like, the liberalism in Chinese domestic markets where there are no effective consumer standards, actually makes the Chinese investment process quite destructive and quite predatory in a number of cases. But I'm also interested to hear in the general case from the last presenter about what else you think is needed in land governance systems for international guidelines to have real traction. Mm-hmm. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Julia, for the questions. Those are great questions. I suggest, because I just got word that our third presenter is actually ready now. And the
right. So sorry about that's what I didn't want to happen.
No. I encourage you to go ahead. But why don't maybe we can just answer that question, try to do a quick answer to this question for now, and then we can move to the presenter. And if it's okay with the other audience, then we can sort of do the rest of the questions later.
Sure.
Is that okay?
Sure.
All right. So trying to give a quick answer. You were totally right. Well, can I'll just start with answering, if that's okay, Yueju, and you can answer the second question after.
No,
yeah. Okay. Just with regards to international guidelines, I think it's a very good question. I've considered this, of course, as well. And so yes, I see international guidelines. Yes, they are a form of soft law. In some cases, I'm not only looking at the voluntary guidelines of the VGT of the FAO, the ones that I did read the quote from them. But yes, it's not very easy to see how they would translate into hard law, that's for sure. But I want to give an example, actually. So I did my fieldwork in Uganda and in Sierra Leone. And in Sierra Leone, it's a completely different scene about how international guidelines were actually adopted and invoked, even as soft law, but it has taken off in a very different way. So there have been trickle-down effects from the sort of national, the higher levels down to the local levels, where there have been awareness-raising workshops on the VGGT and other sets of guidelines. And actually in Sierra Leone, the international guidelines are now translating into law, into the legal framework right now with the national land policy. And there have been many follow-on sort of activities done there, as right now there is an agriculture investment approval process launched by the government, the Ministry of Lands, together with who's funding this? Was it the FAO? I'm not clear exactly who the international funder is, but there are sort of initiatives coming from the proliferation of these guidelines now that are actually very much trying to harmonize international standards within the national legal context. So this is, I guess, a country example, Sierra Leone, where this is looking very differently than in Uganda. What I found interesting specifically for my paper was just that generally the interplay between such sort of international guidelines, and not only the VGGT, but also other ones like the older ones, there's the IFC performance standards, there are certain environmental guidelines, there's a whole range of these, how they were just featuring or not. And I did see patterns, so it's not a perfect sort of proven argument that they work here and they don't work there, but I do think there are discrepancies that are not looked at, how guidelines can actually, how deep they can go inside a national legal framework. And I also don't think that, international guidelines are sometimes seen as sort of that they can take the place of national legal frameworks or laws, which I don't think so. I think it's often underestimated actually what kind of legal structures there are already in place at the local level and at the national level. So in Uganda, you have a fully fledged sort of set of laws governing agriculture and investment law and all that. It might not be implemented in a certain way as international guidelines would like, but it's an interesting interplay how they come into place. But yeah, I mean, I would say that there were initiatives in Uganda. I'm trying not to make this answer too long. There were initiatives with the first sort of awareness raising on international guidelines, especially the FAO voluntary guidelines, where there was a secretariat on the VGGTs housed in the Ministry of Lands. There were initiatives to proliferate down the information on international guidelines. And I feel like in Uganda, it's sort of trickled out a bit. So what would be necessary would be definitely more support to sort of capacity building and awareness raising on these guidelines, which for some reason in Sierra Leone really did happen and took off. And people at the local level that I interviewed knew about international guidelines, which I was very surprised. And these are soft laws in that case too. So it's yeah, I think financial. Sorry, Ueju, you're right. I should. We still have another presenter, so maybe Ueju, if you want to still answer your question.
Yeah, that's great. I'd like to come back on that, but we should hear the other presenter. Really.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah.
Let's get our. Can we broadcast the third presenter? So our third presenter is Dr. Osinovo and his co-author. Ether and Mrs. Osinovo, and their paper will focus on emerging actors and the bureaucracy of government agriculture land allocation in Nigeria.
Yeah, good morning. Sorry, it's a technical issue, but thank God we have been able to resolve it. Sorry for keeping you waiting. I'm Olatokunbo Oshinowo from Ogun State Ministry of Agriculture in Nigeria. I'll be talking about emerging actors and bureaucracy of government agricultural land allocation in Nigeria. Next slide, please. Introduction. That's my presentation. We focus on this simple outline, talk about introduction, materials and method, result and discussion, then conclusion and recommendation. Next slide. Introduction. By the way of introduction, we all know that land is an essential element in agricultural development, and its accessibility is crucial to the attainment of sustainable national development. Many farmers need land to be sustainable in whatever they are doing. It's linked with so many things such as food insecurity, political instability, urban development, economic development, and social progress. Therefore, this kind of a study is very of paramount importance. In 1978, there is an act that was established, the Nigeria Land Use Act, which places the ownership of the land in the hand of state government in trust for the benefit of all citizens. However, the rate of land dispossession and forceful displacement of individual and community was minimal during the earlier period of this act. Next slide. But later, I think people continue to be branching about and putting all this territorial land in the trust of a state government perhaps is the biggest strength and weakness of the Land Use Act. Against this background, my study focused to attempt to answer the following question, and the following specific objectives are to be identified: to identify emerging land disputes facing agricultural land allotment in Southwest Nigeria. The second objective is to identify stages, process, and actors involved in government agricultural land and acquisition in Southwest Nigeria, while the third objective is to examine the effectiveness of government agricultural land allocation process in Southwest. Next slide, please. Materials and method. The study was carried out in Southwest Nigeria. Southwest consists of 6 states, The 6 states consist of Lagos State, Osun State, Oyo State, Ogun State, Ekiti State. And the sampling procedure that was adopted for this work is 2-stage sampling techniques. The first stage involves selection of all these 6 states in the southwest Nigeria, while the second stage involved random selection of 80 government agricultural land allotee, that is beneficiary from each state. Who am I referring to as agricultural land allotee? Agricultural land allotee are those people, that the agricultural investors that government allocate the agricultural land to. Because in each of these 6 states, there is government agricultural land. It's the land that government acquire for solely for agricultural purpose. So this kind of land would be allocated to those who ever show interest to use the said land for agricultural purpose. So these are the beneficiaries that I'm referring to. And primary data were collected using a set of structure questionnaire, and all data were analyzed using descriptive statistics. Next slide, please. Next slide. Result and discussion. Imagine land disputes. For example, the first objective is to look at the dispute facing agricultural land allotee in Southwest. We try to look what are the problems that these allotee are facing. So these are just the major land dispute being faced by all these allotee in the Southwest Nigeria. Number one is limited access to land due to community hostility. This is that when government allocated the land to this beneficiary, they still face a lot of hostility from the community. Hostility in terms of that the original owner of land did not really submit to the will of the state government. So whosoever the government allocated the land to, they try to victimize him while doing his work on that land. So about 242 of our respondents, because total respondent of this project is 480. So out of the 480 respondents, about 242 face this kind of a problem. Likewise, some face the ownership disputes between state, private, individual. About 216 face this kind of a problem. And 42.08% face encroachment and illegal sales of government allocated land. That is the land that has been allocated to them. Some of the community members still go ahead to sell this land to individual for individual use. And likewise, about 41.25% of my respondents face victimization by initial land owners. Community cultural constraints, this just about 196 of our respondents face this problem. Why these farmers and pastoral clashes that have been emerging in Southwest Nigeria have been faced by about 37.08% of our respondents. Next slide. Land titling, that is, this has to do with the land titling, which is 32.5%. Extending urban area, then there is a lot of land that governments acquire for this purpose, but because of the extension of this urban area, majority of people are being faced to take this land for residential purpose. This has really been affecting the agricultural sector in the country. Likewise, the boundary and territorial conflicts, 22.5% was being affected by this. Likewise, improper land valuation by government official. During this land allocation, there is something they call crop enumeration. So they believe that the land valuation by government official, which will determine the amount of money that will be paid by this allotee, that there is improper land valuation in it. And also, one of the problems being faced by this allotee is that maybe a single land is being allocated to multiple users. A case whereby a land that will be allocated to Mr. A, in the long run, maybe after so many years, we find out that Mr. B also have the same letter claiming that the same land is being allocated to him or her. And also, dispute over government annual grant trends. This is just a minimum. About 8.75% of the respondents face this kind of problem. So objective 2. Objective 2 is stages, process, and actors involved in government agricultural land acquisition in Southwest. This objective 2 is being faced by overriding public interest. As you can hear me, the stage and process and actors involved in government agricultural land. The first stage is that there is something they call. Next slide, please. Next slide. Yeah. I'm talking about the stages, process, and actors involved in government. I'm just trying to brush up so that I won't rush out of time. The stages that is involved in government agricultural land acquisition, that when government want to acquire land in Southwest Nigeria, there are some stages that they follow. And the first stage is overriding public interest. That is, whenever there is overriding public interest, the government give the notice that the ministry in charge of this should request and find land that is suitable for that agricultural purpose. So this is what we call the requisition for land. And after that, government will give approval for that land. Next slide. And when government give approval for this land, there is advocacy visit and awareness creation. No, excuse me, come back a little. Advocacy visit and awareness creation. Advocacy visit and awareness creation. So the community, the ministry involved will go to this community for advocacy visits. They will create awareness and tell the community the purpose which land want to be used for. This is usually carried out by Ministry of Agriculture. And after this, there is a site selection. After site selection, there is a perimeter survey of the land. Survey description. After survey description and submission, there is presentation of this survey to the state government that this is what we carve out for this purpose. Then the government will give acquisition notice to the community. When acquisition notice is being given to the community involved. Next slide. Next slide. Then we find out that gazette and adverts. This particular land will be gazette. This particular land will be gazette, and there will be a title clearance for this. After this, government will give them the chance for crop enumeration. Crop enumeration for compensation. That is the initial landowner, those people that has been affected by this, government will give them a compensation. However, this compensation is not the value of the land. The compensation that is being paid by those people that is being affected is the valuation of the crop that the government find on this land. They find the economic value of this, and this amount will be paid to respective farmers or community or the landowner, as the case may be. Then after this, next slide, there is authorization for payment. After authorization for payment, they will invite the community involved for invitation for compensation. And when they invite this community for invitation for compensation, this money will be paid to them. And these people will go back to the community to sensitize them and create awareness and erect a signboard. All these activities is normally being carried out by Ministry of Agriculture official, the Land Department official, then the Ministry of Justice in terms of legal acts. These are the people that were solely responsible for this. And after this, the view of community leader. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. After all this, the view of community leaders and farm household about government acquired agricultural land is being carried out. So we find out that through interview, we find the roles in government acquired land, the challenge they often encounter, and how such were resolved. Our results indicate that government agricultural land acquisition has disposed members of the communities of their large income from agricultural activities being carried out on their parcels of land. The view of the farm household on compensation being received. You know, I said government usually pay compensation to the affected landowner. However, our observation on the field, we discovered that many of these people, that is, many of these those community of farmers that is being affected by this, they complain that the compensation received by them is too small and sometimes being delayed unnecessarily, and sometimes they don't even receive it. And this is one of the reasons whereby those people that the government allocated the land for, they try to victimize them because they assume that they have not really surrendered the said land to the government. And the final next slide, please. Next slide, we try to look at the effectiveness of this allocation process in Southwest. And from our view, from the respondents that we interview, perception that well-documented rules and regulations guide government agricultural land allocation process. Just about 361 out of the 480. I think that's quite good. About 75% of the total of our respondents, they agree that there is a well-documented rules and regulation that guide government agricultural land allocation process in the Southwest. Likewise, about 60% agree that the guideline and information on agricultural land allocation is publicly available. Just about 61% of our respondents agree that there is a clarity of institutional mandate. And the process of government agricultural land allocation is cumbersome. This is being agreed by about 80.42%. That is 386 of our respondents. Out of the 480 respondents, 386 respondents confirm that the process of this allocation process is cumbersome. Next slide. Equity. We also find out about the equity and non-discrimination. The purpose of this is to find out whether there is equity in terms of the gender bias or ethnicity or the state of origin is being affected by this. So we discovered that about 67.92% agree that there is equity and non-discrimination in agricultural land allocation to agricultural investors. Likewise, about 58.96% of our respondents agree that there is a transparency and fairness during this allocation process. About 48.96% of our respondents agree that the government allocate this land to genuine agricultural investors, because sometimes there are some people that they think they are political investors that's looking for this agricultural land for other purpose. However, about 235% of our respondents agree that this land is being allocated to genuine agricultural investors in a timely and efficient manner. We also look at the if there is official receipt or the money being paid during the process, if they receive official receipt for this. This is to look the way whether there is a bribery and corruption in the process. And we discovered that about 59.38% of our respondents agree that they receive official receipts for all the service charges that has been paid. Likewise, about 202 of our respondents agree that they pay unofficial fees for government agricultural land allocation. Whereas about 208 of our respondents agree that whenever there is disputes, government officials come as soon as possible to settle this dispute. Then we also look at the government agency, whether they offer dispute resolution facility efficiently. About 61% of our respondents agreed with this, and 40% of our respondents agree that there is mechanism for public feedback in the system. The crop compensation charges that is being paid by this allottee, that is this government's beneficiary, they are about 201%, about 201 respondents, which represent about 43.96%, agreed that the crop compensation charges is bearable. Government annual grant rent is also bearable by 50%. However, 37.08% of our respondents are aware that land registration information guidelines were publicly available, and about 41.46% of our respondents confirmed that the cost for agricultural land survey is bearable. Likewise, next slide, please. Next slide. Government annual grant net, because there is always, to those all these beneficiaries, there is government annual grant trend that is being paid to government cover, ranging from 1,000 to 5,000. Some beneficiaries agree that this is bearable by them, while some agree that this is not bearable. Beneficiaries are aware that land registration information guidelines are publicly available. Some agree, while some did not agree. But 37% of our respondents agree. However, about 41.46% agree that cost of agricultural land survey is bearable. However, 56.88% of our respondents said they paid unofficial fees for land registration. You know, the other time I talk about land allocation, that is during the allocation process, and now is the registration. When the land is being allocated to you, there is need for you to perfect the title of the land. This is what I'm talking about in terms of land registration. So about 56.88% of our respondents said they pay unofficial fees for this. Next slide, please. However, about 72.92% agree that there is high bureaucracy of government officials. This represents that's about 350 of the respondents, which claim that there is bureaucracy in the process. However, about 93.96%, that is about 451 out of the 480 of our respondents, agree that government agricultural land allocated is more secure than private land. So despite all the challenges being faced in this process, majority of the respondents, which is about 451 out of 480, still agree that this government agricultural land is more secure, that is secure for the investment. And this is the reason why majority always go for this government agricultural land. And about 193 of our respondents confirmed that they were satisfied with the land allocation and registration process. Next slide. In conclusion and recommendation, allocation of government agricultural land to agricultural investors by the state government is not without a risk for host community. You know, though when government acquire land in a particular community, we find out that sometimes there is a rapid growth because of the industrialization and agricultural process industry, or what all this agricultural sector that's been set up in those communities. So in most cases, there is a rapid growth in that area. However, those who were rendered unemployed and whose traditional livelihood are uprooted by this action are left at the mercy of market force. And of course, majority of the people that is being affected by this acquisition claim that the compensation being received by them is somehow too small. They claim that inadequate compensation of the affected landowner have resulted into a political and social fallout in most of this community. Next slide. And finally, the study concluded that government agricultural land acquisition has disposed members of the community of their large parcels of land. So their recommendation, now next slide. Next slide. So therefore, the study now recommends that procedure for acquiring land by state government must be clear and open to all stakeholders. Government should recognize private individual, family, and community properly and grant support to the existing social reality with regard to land rights. The study also recommends transparency in allocation of government agricultural land and fair compensation to the affected landowners. Next slide. agricultural land should be allocated to only genuine agricultural investors in the states. And the study also recommends that guidelines and procedure for land registration should be publicly available, and collection of unofficial fees for land registration should be abrogated. Next slide. Next slide. I think my time is rounding up now. However, I think that's the major part, the connection. That is the summary of what's
Hello. So I don't know, I can't press next slide anymore at the moment. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. I can hear you.
Yeah, somehow I cannot move along the slides anymore. But I'm afraid we are completely out of time. I'm very sorry that with the technical issues, the timings have been pushed back and back.
Yeah.
I have a suggestion. So thank you so much, Dr. Orsinowo. And I have a suggestion that we can all, continue discussions in the coffee room. So I was asked to tell the delegates and everybody here that now there's the coffee break, and in the coffee rooms, discussions can continue. So, and also I see there were 2 questions here that I'm very happy to answer or discuss. And I'm sure there are lots more questions for Dr. Orsinowo and for UAJU. And perhaps, either by email or in the coffee room, we can definitely address those. I'm very sorry that we're totally out of time for the panel right now. But I think overall, sort of at least we had the presentations. I'm very glad to have had Dr. Orsinowo's presentation as well. Thank you so much for listening and for tuning in here. And
you are welcome. You are welcome.